In the quiet village of Harrow's End, nestled between misty hills and ancient woods, there was a shop unlike any other. It sat at the edge of the cobblestone square, its crooked sign swaying gently in the breeze, Ellsworth's emporium of unique creations. Though the shutters were often closed and the interior dim, every villager knew the shop's owner, Mr. Ellsworth, the eccentric dollmaker who rarely left his workshop. The shop window displayed dolls of unparalleled craftsmanship. Each figure was lifelike, with glass eyes that seemed to follow passers-by and intricate features that made them appear frozen mid-breath. Children often pressed their noses against the glass, mesmerized by the miniature worlds Ellsworth created, though their parents rarely allowed them inside. Late one evening, Amelia, a curious teenager with a penchant for the mysterious, found herself wandering the square after a restless day. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the shop's weathered facade. To her surprise, the shutters were open, revealing a doll seated on the display shelf, a pale-faced girl in a delicate lace dress, her golden curls framing a hauntingly familiar expression. Amelia leaned closer to the glass, her breath fogging the surface. The doll's eyes glinted in the moonlight, almost as if it recognized her. Then, without warning, its head tilted ever so slightly. Amelia Harper had always been drawn to the oddities of Harrow's End. While others saw their village as a quaint but sleepy place, she found its secrets alluring. The ivy-covered ruins at the forest's edge, the ancient gravestones tilted with time, and of course Mr. Ellsworth's peculiar shop. These were the pieces of a puzzle Amelia longed to solve. Her fascination with the dollmaker began years ago, when she first noticed the delicate craftsmanship of his dolls. They weren't like the toys in catalogs or the porcelain trinkets her grandmother displayed. Ellsworth's creations were uncanny in their realism, each one bearing an aura of individuality, as if they had once been alive. Though she'd seen Mr. Ellsworth only a handful of times, she'd never forgotten his appearance. He was tall and gaunt, with long fingers that twitched nervously when he spoke. His gray hair, always slightly disheveled, framed a face etched with deep lines, and his voice carried the weight of someone who spent more time speaking to himself than to others. Amelia's mother had warned her about him. "Stay away from that shop," she'd said firmly. "There's something not right about him or those dolls." But Amelia's curiosity had always been her strongest trait, even when it led her into trouble. That night, as she stared at the doll in the window, her unease mingled with fascination. The doll's golden curls and pale features mirrored her own so closely that it felt like looking at a miniature version of herself. Unable to resist, she pushed open the shop's creaking door. A bell chimed faintly, its sound swallowed by the oppressive silence within. The air was heavy with the scent of varnish and aged wood. Shelves lined the walls, each packed with rows of dolls in various stages of completion. Some were dressed in fine silks, their painted faces serene, while others were little more than wooden frames, their hollow eyes staring blankly. A workbench stood at the center, cluttered with tools, fabrics, and sketches. "Hello?" Amelia called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. From the shadows emerged Mr. Ellsworth, his presence as unnerving as she remembered. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing as they settled on her. "We're closed," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I saw the doll in the window," Amelia stammered, gesturing behind her. "It looks like me." Ellsworth's expression darkened. "Many dolls resemble their owners, it's merely coincidence." Amelia wasn't convinced. The doll's resemblance to her went beyond chance. It was uncanny. "Did someone commission it?" she asked, stepping closer. Ellsworth hesitated, then motioned toward a small table near the corner. "Perhaps you'd like to see for yourself." On the table lay an open ledger, its pages filled with names and dates. Amelia scanned the entries, her fingers stopping on a familiar name, Amelia Harper. Her blood ran cold. Next to her name was a date, a week from today. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. Ellsworth's expression softened, but his answer offered no comfort. "Each doll is made with care," he said, his voice almost gentle. "But they're more than art. They're a way to preserve something fleeting." Amelia stepped back, her heart pounding. "Preserve what?" Before he could answer, a soft creak came from the far side of the room. She turned to see a cabinet door ajar, revealing rows of dolls identical to the villagers she knew. Her school teacher, her neighbor, even the postman, they were all there, staring back at her with lifeless eyes. Ellsworth moved closer, his long shadow falling over her. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his tone carrying a hint of regret. "Some secrets are better left undiscovered." Amelia's breath quickened as she backed toward the door. But just as she reached for the handle, the dolls on the shelves began to stir. Their tiny heads turned in unison, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light. "Leave now, while you still can," Ellsworth warned, his voice barely audible over the sudden hum that filled the room. Amelia didn't need to be told twice. She fled into the night, the bell's chime echoing behind her. As she ran home, her mind raced with questions. What was Ellsworth hiding? How could her name be in his ledger? And why did the doll in the window look so much like her? But deep down, she already knew one thing. Whatever the answer, it wouldn't be simple or safe. The next morning, Amelia awoke with a pounding heart and the unsettling memory of her visit to Ellsworth's shop. She told herself it was a dream, a trick of her overactive imagination, but the events replayed in her mind with vivid clarity. The doll, the ledger, the whispered warnings, they felt too real to dismiss. At breakfast, her mother noticed her unease. "You look pale, Amelia. Are you feeling all right?" Amelia nodded, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." Her mother didn't press further, but Amelia's thoughts churned. She resolved to uncover the truth, even if it meant returning to the shop. But not yet. She needed answers before confronting Ellsworth again. Amelia spent the day in the village, asking subtle questions about the Dollmaker. Most people avoided the topic, offering little more than passing remarks about his reclusive nature. A few, however, hinted at something darker. "I've heard strange things about that shop," whispered Mrs. Wilkes, the grocer's wife. "People say the dolls are cursed, that they hold pieces of their owners' souls." Amelia laughed nervously. "That sounds like a ghost story." "Maybe it is," Mrs. Wilkes said, lowering her voice. "But some of those dolls look an awful lot like people who have disappeared from Harrow's and over the years." The comment sent a chill down Amelia's spine. She remembered the rows of dolls in Ellsworth's cabinet, each one a perfect replica of someone she knew. Could it be true? That night, unable to shake her unease, Amelia returned to her room and locked the door. She pulled out her sketchbook, a gift from her late grandmother, and began to draw the doll from the shop window. The pencil moved almost on its own, capturing every detail, the golden curls, the lace dress, the eerie expression that mirrored her own. When she finished, she stared at the drawing, her chest tightening with dread. The doll's eyes seemed to follow her, just as they had in the shop. She turned the sketchbook face down on her desk and climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. As the hours crept by, the room grew colder. Amelia pulled the blankets tighter around her, shivering. Then she heard a faint tapping sound, like fingernails on glass. Her eyes darted to the window, where the moonlight cast long shadows across the floor. The tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. Heart pounding, Amelia forced herself to look. A figure stood outside, partially obscured by the frost-covered glass. It was small, childlike, with golden curls that gleamed in the moonlight. The doll. Amelia gasped, stumbling out of bed. When she turned back to the window, the figure was gone. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the edge of her bed, clutching a flashlight and waiting for dawn. When the first rays of sunlight broke through the curtains, she knew what she had to do. The shop was closed when Amelia arrived, but she didn't let that stop her. She tried the door, and to her surprise, it creaked open. The bell's chime echoed through the empty space as she stepped inside. "Mr. Ellsworth," she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer. The shop was as she remembered, rows of dolls staring blankly from their perches, the workbench cluttered with tools and scraps of fabric. But something was different. The cabinet in the corner was wide open, and the dolls inside were missing. Amelia's eyes scanned the room, landing on the ledger she'd seen the night before. It lay open on the workbench, its pages fluttering in the draft. Her name was still there, but now there was a note scribbled beside it. Collection complete. A chill ran down her spine. What did it mean? Before she could dwell on the thought, a creak sounded from the back room. Amelia hesitated, then crept toward the door, her steps as silent as possible. The room beyond was dimly lit, filled with unfinished dolls and half-carved wooden forms. At the center stood Mr. Ellsworth, his back to her as he worked on something at a tall table. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. He froze, then turned slowly to face her. His hands were stained with paint, or was it something darker? His eyes, usually tired and withdrawn, burned with intensity. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low. "It's not safe." "What are you doing?" Amelia demanded, stepping closer. "What does collection complete mean?" Ellsworth sighed, his shoulders slumping. "You've seen too much," he said, almost regretfully. "But perhaps it's time someone knew the truth." He gestured to the table, where a doll lay half-finished. Its features were unmistakable. It was Amelia. Her breath caught in her throat. "Why does it look like me?" Ellsworth hesitated before answering. "These dolls are more than they seem. They're vessels, imbued with fragments of life. They preserve what's most precious: memory, essence, spirit, but the process requires sacrifices." Amelia's stomach churned. "What kind of sacrifices?" Before he could answer, the dolls on the shelves began to stir again, their movements more pronounced than before. Heads turned, limbs twitched, and a faint, eerie whisper filled the air. Ellsworth's expression darkened. "You need to leave now." But Amelia stood her ground. "Not until you tell me the truth." Ellsworth reached for her, but the dolls suddenly erupted into motion, falling from their perches and clattering to the floor. Amelia ducked as one narrowly missed her head. The room filled with chaos as the dolls began to move on their own, their tiny hands grasping at her ankles. Ellsworth shouted something, but his words were drowned out by the cacophony. Amelia bolted for the door, her heart racing. As she fled into the night, the whispers followed her, growing louder until they were a deafening roar. She didn't stop running until she reached the safety of her home. Amelia bolted her bedroom door and collapsed onto her bed, her chest heaving. The whispers from the shop still echoed in her mind, a chorus of voices too soft to discern, but too loud to ignore. She knew she had uncovered something terrible, something that could not be unseen. As she tried to calm her racing thoughts, her gaze fell on the sketchbook on her desk. It was open to the drawing she had made of the doll, her doll. Its lifelike eyes seemed to meet hers, full of quiet accusation. Before she could look away, the pencil on her desk moved. It rolled toward the sketchbook, stopping at the edge as if waiting for her to act. Amelia's breath caught. "Thou," she whispered, shaking her head. "This isn't real." But the room grew colder, and the faint scent of varnish filled the air. The shadows on the walls deepened, stretching toward her as though alive. The pencil rolled again, landing on the sketchbook with a soft thud. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Flipping to a blank page, she held the pencil poised, unsure of what she was meant to do. Then, as if guided by an unseen hand, it began to move. The lines were hesitant at first, then smoother, faster. Amelia watched in horror as an image emerged, a dark room filled with dolls, each one bound to strings like marionettes. At the center stood a figure she recognized, Mr. Ellsworth. The pencil froze, the image complete. Her heart sank as she realized what it meant. She had to go back. The shop was exactly as she had left it, the front door ajar and the bell silent. Amelia stepped inside, her resolve bolstered by the weight of the sketchbook in her bag. "Mr. Ellsworth," she called, her voice steady despite the chill that enveloped her. This time, he was waiting for her. He stood behind the workbench, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have returned," he said softly. "I need answers," Amelia said, pulling out the sketchbook. She placed it on the table, open to the drawing of the marionette room. "What is this?" Ellsworth's eyes flicked to the page, and for a moment, he looked almost afraid. "It's the truth," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "This shop, these dolls, they're part of something older than you can imagine. The craft was passed down to me, but I didn't understand the cost until it was too late." Amelia's stomach twisted. "What cost?" "The dolls are vessels," Ellsworth explained. "They capture fragments of life, enough to preserve the essence of a person, to keep them tethered to this world, but the process isn't perfect. The soul remains incomplete, restless, and the dolls, they're not content to stay still." As if on cue, the dolls around the room began to stir. Their movements were slow, deliberate, as though testing the limits of their strings. Amelia stepped back, her heart pounding. "What do they want?" Ellsworth's gaze hardened. "Freedom. They've been bound for too long, and they blame me for their imprisonment, but I'm not the one they need." "What does that mean?" Amelia asked, dread creeping into her voice. Ellsworth hesitated before answering. "The doll in the window, it was meant to resemble you, but something changed when you entered this shop. The craft, it chose you." Amelia's breath hitched. "No, that's not possible." "You've seen it," Ellsworth said, his voice urgent. "You felt it. The connection is already there. If you don't sever it, you'll become one of them." The dolls moved faster now, their strings tangling and snapping as they pulled free from their perches. One by one they turned toward Amelia, their glass eyes glinting in the dim light. "What do I do?" she whispered, clutching the edge of the table. Ellsworth handed her a small knife, its blade worn but sharp. "The only way to break the bond is to destroy the doll that bears your likeness, but be warned, if you fail, it will take you instead." Amelia stared at the knife, her hands trembling. "Where is it?" "In the cabinet," Ellsworth said, his voice steady. but you'll have to face them to get to it." The dolls moved as one, their tiny hands reaching for her. Amelia gripped the knife tightly, her pulse racing. She darted toward the cabinet, dodging the grasping dolls with every step. When she reached it, she flung the doors open and scanned the shelves. There in the corner was the doll, her doll. Its painted face was serene, its golden curls glinting in the dim light. Amelia reached for it, but the dolls swarmed her, their movements frantic and uncoordinated. She slashed at them with the knife, their porcelain faces shattering under the blade. Finally, her fingers closed around the doll. She raised the knife, hesitating for only a moment before plunging it into the doll's chest. A deafening silence followed. The dolls froze, their limbs slack, and the oppressive chill lifted from the room. Ellsworth stepped forward, his face lined with relief. "It's done," he said. Amelia dropped the knife, her legs giving way beneath her. She sank to the floor, cradling the shattered remains of the doll. But as she looked up, she saw Ellsworth's expression change. His relief turned to fear as he whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Before she could respond, the shop dissolved into darkness. When Amelia awoke, she was no longer in the shop. The familiar warmth of sunlight bathed her face, and she found herself lying in her own bed. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream, a twisted product of her imagination. But as she sat up, the weight of something in her hand made her freeze. She looked down to find the broken doll cradled in her fingers, its porcelain face cracked, but still eerily lifelike. A shiver ran down her spine. She glanced around her room, everything appearing just as it always had. Yet, the sense of unease lingered, like a shadow she couldn't shake. Amelia carefully placed the doll on her desk and stood, her legs unsteady beneath her. The events of the previous night replayed in her mind, the whispers, the moving dolls, the knife in her hand. She couldn't deny what had happened. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her back to the present. It was a message from Clara. "Clara, where did you go last night? I stopped by your house, but you weren't there. Call me ASAP." Amelia stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? She walked to her desk and opened the sketchbook, flipping through the pages. The drawing of the marionette room was gone, replaced by a blank sheet. But as she turned to the last page, her heart sank. A new drawing had appeared, one of her bedroom, with the broken doll sitting on the desk. Amelia's pulse quickened. She grabbed the sketchbook and flipped it shut, shoving it into a drawer. The doll remained on the desk, its painted eyes fixed on her. For a moment, she considered throwing it away, but a strange compulsion stopped her. It was as if the doll still held a part of her, something she couldn't abandon. As the hours passed, Amelia tried to return to normalcy. She made tea, read a book, and even stepped outside to feel the warmth of the sun. But no matter how hard she tried, the image of the doll lingered in her mind. That night, as she lay in bed, the room seemed quieter than usual. The faint hum of the city outside was muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Amelia turned to face the desk, her eyes falling on the doll. It sat perfectly still, yet its presence felt alive. She closed her eyes, willing herself to sleep. But just as she drifted off, she heard a soft, familiar sound, the faint creak of a chair shifting under weight. Her eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The doll was exactly where she had left it, unmoving and silent. Yet, as she stared, a single thought whispered through her mind, Was it watching her, or was something else watching through it? Amelia pulled the covers tightly around herself and closed her eyes again, determined to find peace. But deep down, she knew the truth. Some secrets were never meant to be uncovered, and some bonds were never meant to be broken. As the moonlight spilled into her room and the night deepened, Amelia drifted into a restless sleep, unaware of the faintest tilt of the doll's head toward her, as if it were guarding its secret and her fate until the next midnight.